December 14, 1944, Puerto Princesa Prison Camp, Philippines. The air raid siren began to wail at noon. It was a sound the 150 American prisoners of war knew well. For 3 years, these men had been rotting in the jungle. They were the survivors of Bataan and Corregidor. They were skeletons, building an airfield for the Japanese Empire with their bare hands. When the siren screamed, the Japanese guards started shouting, "Air raid! Air raid! Into the shelters!" Private Eugene Nielsen, a 28-year-old from Utah, grabbed his hat. He looked at the sky. It was blue and empty. No American planes, no bombers. Usually, the guards didn't care if the prisoners lived or died during a raid, but today they were aggressive. They were pushing the Americans into the trenches with rifle butts. These weren't deep bunkers. They were open-topped slit trenches covered only by light logs and dirt dug into the side of a coral cliff. Nielsen climbed into Trench C. It was cramped. 50 men were packed shoulder to shoulder. It smelled of sweat and fear. Something felt wrong. Usually the guards jumped into their own bunkers. Today they stayed outside. Nielsen looked through a crack between the logs. He saw a Japanese officer standing on the edge of the trench. He wasn't holding a weapon, he was holding a bucket. And the liquid sloshing inside didn't smell like water, it smelled like high-octane aviation fuel. The ignition. The officer didn't say a word. He splashed the gasoline into the crowded trench. The cold liquid hit the men's faces. It soaked their rags. It pooled on the floor. Before anyone could scream, a second soldier threw a lighted torch into the pit. Whoosh! It wasn't an explosion. It was an instant inferno. The trench turned into a blast furnace. 50 men caught fire simultaneously. The screams were deafening. It was a sound of pure agony that drowned out the sirens. Nielsen was lucky. He was near the end of the trench. The gas hadn't soaked him completely. He saw his friends, men he had lived with for 3 years, turning into human torches. They were clawing at the dirt walls, trying to climb out, but the Japanese were waiting. As the burning Americans scrambled over the lip of the trench, the guards opened fire. Machine guns rattled, bayonets flashed. The guards were laughing. They were spearing the burning men like fish, pushing them back into the fire. Nielsen realized the truth. This wasn't an air raid. This was an extermination. The kill-all order had been given. The choice. Nielsen had 2 choices: stay and burn, or climb and be shot. He chose a third option. The trenches were dug near the edge of a coral cliff that dropped down to the beach. While the guards were distracted by the screaming men at the center of the trench, Nielsen dug. He clawed at the roots and the dirt at the far end of the shelter. The heat was blistering his skin. The smoke was blinding him. He found a small opening where the logs had rotted away. He squeezed through. He wasn't out yet. He was in no man's land, a strip of grass between the burning trenches and the cliff drop. He lay flat on his stomach. He watched as a Japanese officer walked up to a wounded American who had managed to crawl out. The American's legs were burned to the bone. He was begging for water. The officer poured gasoline on the man's head and lit a match. Nielsen bit his own arm to stop himself from screaming. He knew he had to move. He had to jump off the cliff. It was a 50-foot drop onto jagged coral rocks. The drop. Nielsen crawled to the edge. He looked down. The tide was out. Below him were sharp rocks and garbage. The camp dump was located at the bottom of the cliff. He heard boots approaching. A patrol was checking the perimeter for escapees. Nielsen didn't hesitate. He rolled over the edge. He fell. He crashed through vines and tree roots. He hit the pile of garbage at the bottom. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He felt something snap in his leg. But he was alive. He was out of the fire. He buried himself under the trash, rotting food, tin cans, and filth. He became part of the garbage. Above him, on the cliff edge, the Japanese soldiers were shooting down at anything that moved. They were throwing grenades down the cliff face. Boom! Boom! Shrapnel tore through the trash pile. Nielsen lay still, breathing through a rusty tin can. He had to wait for nightfall. He had to wait for the screaming to stop. Nielsen lay under a pile of rotting coconuts and empty tin cans. The smell was unbearable, but it masked his own scent. He wasn't alone. A few feet away, beneath a layer of palm fronds, he saw a pair of eyes. It was Private Glenn McDowell. He was burned on his back and arms. He was shaking uncontrollably. "Quiet," Nielsen mouthed. Above them, the Japanese patrol had found a way down the cliff. They were walking through the garbage dump, bayonets fixed. They were poking the piles of trash, looking for soft flesh. Thump, thump. A bayonet stabbed the ground inches from Nielsen's head. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. He became a stone. The soldiers laughed, lit cigarettes, and moved on to the beach. They began shooting into the caves where other survivors were hiding. They used dynamite to seal the entrances, burying men alive. Nielsen and McDowell realized the island was a slaughterhouse. If they stayed, they died. Their only exit was the ocean. Night fell. The fires in the trenches were still burning, casting a red glow over the cliffs. Nielsen and McDowell crawled to the water's edge. They had to swim across Puerto Princesa Bay. It was 5 miles to the other side. 5 miles is a long swim for a healthy man. For men with third-degree burns and bullet wounds, it was torture. They slipped into the water. Hiss! The salt water hit their burns like acid. It felt like they were being skinned alive. Nielsen gagged, fighting the urge to scream. The pain was blinding. "Keep moving," he whispered to McDowell. "Numbness will set in." They started to paddle. They couldn't use a crawl stroke. The splashing would attract the patrol boats. They used a silent dog paddle, keeping their noses just above the surface. Behind them, the sounds of execution continued. Bang, bang. The Japanese were finishing the job. They were halfway across the bay when the searchlight swept over the water. A Japanese patrol boat was hunting. The engine noise grew louder. The beam of light cut through the darkness, scanning for floating heads. "Dive!" Nielsen signaled. They took a deep breath and went under. Underwater, it was silent. Nielsen opened his eyes. The salt water stung. He looked up and saw the hull of the boat pass directly over him. The propeller churned the water, missing his legs by feet. He stayed under until his lungs burned. He surfaced, gasping quietly. The boat was moving away. But the boat wasn't the only predator in the bay. Puerto Princesa is famous for 2 things: pearls and hammerhead sharks. Something brushed against McDowell's leg. It was rough, like sandpaper. McDowell froze. He knew that if he thrashed, he was dead. He floated, playing dead in the water. The shark circled once, a dark shadow in the bioluminescence, and swam away. Perhaps the smell of gasoline on their skin saved them, or perhaps the shark was already full from the bodies dumping into the bay. After 4 hours of swimming, they hit the mangroves on the other side. They tried to stand up, but their legs collapsed. They were exhausted, hypothermic, and in shock. They dragged themselves through the mud, deep into the jungle swamp. They were safe from the Japanese garrison, but they were now in enemy territory, surrounded by miles of jungle, snakes, and disease. They collapsed under a banyan tree. Nielsen looked at his arm. The skin was peeling off from the burns. "We made it," McDowell whispered. "We beat them." But the ordeal wasn't over. They had to survive the jungle, and they had to find someone to tell. Because back at the camp, 139 men were dead, and the world didn't know. Nielsen swore an oath that night. "I will live, and I will make them pay." Nielsen and McDowell crawled through the jungle for another day. They were dying of infection. The flies were laying eggs in their burns. Then they saw a silhouette, a man with a rifle. Nielsen tried to run, thinking it was a Japanese patrol. "Americano?" the man whispered. It was a Filipino guerrilla. The locals took them in. They treated their burns with coconut oil and herbs. They fed them rice. For the first time in years, Nielsen slept without fear of a bayonet. The guerrillas radioed the U.S. Army Intelligence, CIC. "We have 2 survivors from Puerto Princesa. They say everyone else is dead." A PBY Catalina was sent to extract them. When Nielsen arrived at the U.S. base on Morotai, the intelligence officers couldn't believe his story at first. "They burned them?" a general asked, his face pale. "Alive?" "Yes, sir," Nielsen rasped. "They laughed while they did it." His testimony changed the war. It triggered the Great Raid on Cabanatuan, our previous story, because the generals realized the Japanese were liquidating all POW camps. Nielsen's escape saved thousands of other prisoners by forcing the U.S. Army to act fast. February 28, 1945. The U.S. Army 41st Infantry Division landed on Palawan. Eugene Nielsen didn't stay in the hospital. He asked to go back. He had to show them where the pits were. He led the troops to the prison camp. It was abandoned. The Japanese had fled into the hills. The camp was silent. The trenches were filled with dirt. "Dig here," Nielsen pointed to Trench C. The soldiers dug. The smell hit them first, the smell of charred meat and decay that had been sealed underground for 2 months. Then they found the bodies, or what was left of them, skeletons fused together by fire, men huddled in corners, hugging each other in their final moments. They found skulls crushed by rifle butts. They found bodies riddled with bayonet holes. Hardened combat veterans, men who had seen everything, threw up. Some cried, others just gripped their rifles, their knuckles turning white with rage. They realized this wasn't war. This was a crime scene.
The U.S. Army didn't just secure the island. They hunted. They hunted the Japanese garrison with a ferocity that was unusual even for the Pacific War. They weren't taking prisoners. Whenever they found a Japanese bunker, they didn't ask for surrender. They used flamethrowers. They gave the enemy the same death they had given the prisoners. "Remember Palawan" became a battle cry. Nielsen identified the officers from photos. He pointed out the men who had poured the gas. After the war, 16 Japanese soldiers were tried for the massacre. Lieutenant General Seiichi Terada and others were sentenced to hang. Nielsen stood in the courtroom. He looked at the men who had tried to burn him alive. They wouldn't look him in the eye. He was the ghost that came back to haunt them.
In 1952, a memorial was built on the site of the massacre. The bones of the 139 victims were disinterred and brought home to the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis. They were buried in a mass grave because they couldn't be separated. They died together, and they rest together. Eugene Nielsen lived a long life, but he never forgot the smell of gasoline. He never forgot the screams. The Palawan Massacre remains a brutal reminder of the fragility of civilization. It shows us that the line between soldier and murderer is thin, and once crossed, there is no going back. 150 men went into the trenches. 11 survived the escape. Only a few made it home. If this story of survival against all odds moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe. We must remember them. Rest in peace, boys.